Deborah, you really are a China expert. We always love it when you're on. Give us a sense of how China has changed in the last 25 years. And one way I can start actually is COVID. COVID has changed us all. What about President Xi's reaction to COVID and zero COVID, as it's called?
Well, really excellent question. And David, it's so nice to see you again. Thanks for having me on. China has changed unbelievably in the last 25 years. As I look back when I was doing trade negotiations at that time, one of the most fundamental concessions that we got from the Chinese, just to give you an example and put this in context, is the fact that they would actually have to publish their trade laws, and only ones that were published were enforceable. So we've come a long way as they've built a world-class legal system and trade system. Now, enforcement's a whole other question, but it shows the significant changes that we've seen over time in the development of the economy. COVID is a whole other issue. Xi today reiterated his position on following a dynamic COVID policy. They have definite concerns about the impact that it's had on the economy, but he had reiterated the fact that people were willing to sacrifice on the social and economic cost given the potential of deaths. And China had an article recently in Nature magazine where they estimated that if Omicron were allowed to go free, essentially in China, it could result in 1.6 million deaths. China is not going to stand for that, particularly in the lead up to the party plenum likely this November. So for Xi, they now look at what is the impact on the economy. As he looks last year was a banner year for China. They were the largest source of direct foreign investments. Most foreign companies who were there reiterated they were going to stay. The majority of them were profitable. They were positive about the prospects. Xi went into 2022 in a very strong position and with a view that his policy around COVID was the best in the world. Now hits Ukraine, Russia's invasion, world potential recession, and then the lockdown in Shanghai. Definitely was overzealous officials who were going after that, but that had both a psychological impact when it was a city as sophisticated and as crucial to China as Shanghai, but also to the rest of the world. And it's really causing ripples through the economy. We're likely to only see 0%, negative growth or 0% growth in the second quarter, and they definitely will not hit their targets of 5.5% that they had for this year. But I want to say one last thing too. When Xi Jinping made his comments doubling down, and he was in Wuhan, obviously where COVID first broke out, to make these comments, the most important thing that the Chinese did was actually put out a policy to try and govern and create guidelines for actions that local officials should take if there's a COVID breakout in their city. And this is an attempt to address this issue of overzealous officials to limit the economic impact where possible when there are just a few breakouts.
So, Deborah, that's interesting, sort of cabin, as it were, some of the activities of local officials. At the same time, a lot of Western experts that we talk to here on Bloomberg say, President Xi's approach on zero COVID is just wrong. He's going to have to change, have to go over to vaccinations. He's going to have to change his economic approach overall. Is that the way President Xi sees it? Because there are some indications, you pointed out a chart actually indicating that if you look at the objective norms of how many deaths per million by COVID and also the reduction in GDP, China's not doing all that bad.
Right. I mean, looking at that Bloomberg chart, it is pretty astonishing if you just look at that chart, how well China has done compared to other countries. If I can't say whether Xi honestly believes it's the right policy or not, but there's no question they're not going to change it. They may fiddle around the edges. They now call it the dynamic COVID policy in the lead up to the party plenum later this year. But if the goal is to create economic growth, they only have a number of limited options to do that. They have not doubled down on fiscal or monetary policy. They've kept it relatively stable. So the only other option that they have is they really need to find a way to generate growth in consumption. China did not see the kind of consumption bump that the United States and Western Europe saw. People were not taking their money and going out and buying during COVID, buying goods when they couldn't buy services. Instead, what's happened, and this has been particularly exacerbated after Shanghai, is people are hoarding their money because they're concerned if there is a COVID breakout in their city, they're going to have to pay for it. So they're not spending money, they're just keeping it. And that is having a dampening effect on the economy, and definitely a dampening effect on consumption. So the only way that they can start to free up that money is if the Chinese people feel safe. And in the short term, they're not going to feel safe if China opens the borders, because that is absolutely going to result in additional cases of COVID. So they only have a few limited options. They have to start to vaccinate the population. And even though China has high vaccination rates, amongst the elderly, it's very low. And if we look at Hong Kong as an example, the overwhelming majority, over 90% of the deaths there were in the elderly in Hong Kong. So as an example, extrapolating into China, there's a lot of fear about that.
You didn't refer much to trade with the outside world. How important is it to President Xi and his regime to actually get back into a situation where you have more growth that's generated by international trade rather than domestically?
Well, they've certainly substituted export growth initially in the post-COVID world to government investment. And so that was a critical part of economic growth as they started to open up again after their first shutdown with COVID. It is a very important part, but they know that they have to diversify. Even though they had record exports to the United States last year, they know that they have to diversify from the market because obviously with the politics, different politicians are looking at ways to try and limit Chinese imports into the US. And there's a lot of concern about the growing trade deficit. The Europeans, particularly as we've heard coming out of the G7, are also starting to reconsider their policies with China, and China anticipates that Europe could start shutting down their market. And so they've been very active in looking for new markets. And we have seen a regular and steady flow of leaders from the Middle East, for example, traveling to China and signing trade deals.
Deborah, you mentioned a couple of times this 20th party plenum toward the end of the year, maybe around November time. I mean, in a sense, we have midterms in the United States. They've got their own elections of a sort for President Xi over there. How is that affecting decision-making right now by President Xi and the people around him?
Well, I'm sure President Xi was hoping for stability going into this year, and he certainly didn't get that on the economic front. And there's certainly a lot of concern, even domestically, with unrest for two reasons. One, objections to these very stringent COVID policies with complete lockdowns, but two, because we're seeing over 18% unemployment amongst Chinese youth. And when you look at the social contract that China had basically made, the Chinese government had made with the middle class, part of it was that they would be willing to trade away some of their social liberties in exchange for continued economic growth. And when many of these families are highly dependent on one child to support the parents and two sets of grandparents, it's critically important that these children can find jobs. But as we look ahead to the plenum, and ironically, it might even be around the same time as the US midterms, one of the really interesting factors that Xi has in his favor when it comes to his own position of power is that there is going to be over 60% turnover at the Central Committee. And most of the new people who will be coming in due to China's age limits are going to be people who were born in the 1960s. They have a very different perspective. Many have traveled widely overseas. They have been educated overseas. They are professionals in their fields. They are going to be the feeders to the Politburo, who are then feeders to the Standing Committee, which are the top group that then rule China, and part of this collective leadership along with Xi Jinping.